In the day and age that we live in, everything, it seems like, is documented in video or in pictures. Some of those things, we're kind of excited that they get documented and recorded and that we can go back and look on them. This past week, Facebook pops up memories that you posted. And this past week, the memory popped up of we were able to record Brennan's first steps. Just happened, you had the camera out and you're recording, and lo and behold, he took his first steps. But then sometimes there's other things that are recorded and documented that maybe you wish you wouldn't have had recorded and stuff, but everyone else sadly gets to enjoy it and benefit from it. Came across a couple years ago a video of a girl who was on a zip line in Puerto Rico, and she is zipping through the trees of Puerto Rico on something that might have been very terrifying, but the caption when I originally saw this video said that this is my life and all the emotions I go through in life wrapped up in 2 minutes. So I want you to check out this video and see her.
No, 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 no! Oh, wait, much better! Oh,
That's a video I could watch over and over again, and like every emotion she goes through, I'm like, yeah, man, I feel it. I know what you're going through with all that. Man, but that's how it is sometimes in life. We are going through this series we're calling Getting Over It, and we're talking about baggage. And in our life, we carry different types of baggage, and like I've said before, that some of the baggage is new baggage that we've picked up recently, but the unfortunate thing is that a lot of times we add it to the old baggage that we have in our life, and we don't drop the old things. We don't leave them behind. And over the past several weeks, we've looked at some of the different types of baggage. Now, unfortunately, there's lots more kinds of baggage than what we've looked at. But the very first week, we talked about bitterness and the pain that it causes us because we hold on to the unforgiveness of someone else. Or even the pride and how sometimes we can try and be the best and do the best, but after a while, our pride really becomes our greatest weakness. Or even last week with our jealousy, when we miss really what God has in store for us because we're so consumed with what he's given to others. And today, we're going to wrap up the series by looking at this topic of fear. Fear, like so many other things, has two different sides to it, and really some of the different bits of baggage we've looked at are the same way. There is sort of a good side to it and a negative side to it. Even with things like bitterness. Maybe it started out as a thing of we were trying to protect ourselves. Maybe we got hurt in some way and we were just trying to hold back and protect ourselves, but it turned into something even more, and then we ended up with bitterness in our heart. Or maybe pride. Again, maybe we were striving for our best. We were trying to do our best, be our best, and just try and excel in those ways. But after a while, it becomes so much about us and me, and we forget about everyone else. And really, fear is no different. There are good sides of fear, but there's also negative sides of fear. University of Southern California neuroscientists treated a lady who suffered from a disease called the Urbach-Wife disease. And this is a disease that makes it so that this lady was incapable, didn't have any ability to feel fear. She had no fear in life. There was no way that her brain processed this emotion of fear. And she's actually one of only 400 people in the world that had this condition. Now, you may hear that, and at first I think, well, that's kind of nice. I mean, to not have any fear, that'd be great. And because I don't know about you, but there are some things in life that I look at and I'm like, ooh, that would be nice to try. But it's like, there's no way I'm doing it. Maybe it's something like going skydiving. People always talk about wanting to go skydiving. I have a feeling that I would be the guy that would get to the door and I'd have a death grip on there and they'd have to knock me out to throw me out the door. The idea sounds so great, but there's things in life that sometimes we look at, we say, that would be great to do, but we're so afraid of it. But the thing is that we need fear in our lives in some ways, because sometimes fear keeps us from doing things that we really shouldn't be doing. While fear may keep me from doing something exciting and fun, fear also keeps me from doing things like getting up on my 2-story roof and trying to replace it myself. We hired a company to do that because it's not so much that I'm afraid of falling off the roof. I'm afraid of the sudden stop at the bottom, right? That's the part that scares me the most. And so my fear of that stops me from making poor decisions. But that's not the kind of fear I'm talking about today. Not the kind of fear of you're afraid of riding the latest ride at Busch Gardens or something else like that. I'm talking about the kind of fear that keeps us from living the life that God intended us for, the life that God made us for. In John 10:10, Jesus says this. He says, "The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. But I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." You see, there are many people today that their life has been stolen from them. Their life has been killed or destroyed. And a big part is because of the fear that they allow to really consume themselves and to control them. And maybe you're in a spot today where that's you. Maybe you're in a spot where fear is holding you back from something. And again, it's not maybe it's not the sky is falling kind of fear where you think the world is going to end and that kind of thing. But maybe it's just the kind of fear that's keeping you from enjoying and experiencing the full and abundant life that God really made you for. And so my hope today is that we're going to look at 4 different people in the Bible, 4 examples of people who experience fear in the Bible. And my hope is by us looking at their example that somewhere in one of these 4 examples that you might look and say, okay, yeah, that's me right there. That's my fear. That's the one that I'm struggling with. And who knows? Maybe you're going to be like, all 4 are me. Or maybe you're just going to say one of them. I don't know what it is. But my hope is that when we see ourselves in their story, I hope that by the end, we can then see how God freed them from their baggage of fear and how God can do the same thing for us. So the first person we're going to look at this morning is Peter. Now, if you know anything about the Apostle Peter, you might not expect him to be on the list of people with fears, because this was not a guy that seemed to really hold anything back. He was a guy that was he was not the look before you leap. He was the leap and then maybe wish I hadn't leapt in the first place. He was the kind of open mouth and insert foot kind of person and just sort of said whatever came to mind and did whatever popped into his brain. And even one of the things that he was, I guess you could say, most famous for in some ways really ended up being something that you would think you could look at it and say it was brave, but we see a lot of fear building up inside of him. It happens where it's recorded in Matthew 14 and verse 25. It says this: "Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake," walking on water. "When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. 'It's a ghost,' they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, 'Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid.' 'Lord, if it's you,' Peter replied, 'tell me to come to you on the water.' 'Come,' he said. Then Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, and he was afraid and began to sink and cried out, 'Lord, save me.' Immediately Jesus reached out his hand, caught him. 'You of little faith,' he said, 'why did you doubt?'" You see, in this moment of courage for Peter, in this moment of him taking this big step, of him doing this incredible thing of walking on water, he sees Jesus out there on the water, and he's like, I want to do that. I want to go out there. I want to be with you, Jesus. And when he takes that step and he goes out there, all of a sudden he becomes very just aware of what's really going on around him. And he sees the waves, he feels the wind, and he realizes where he is. And maybe he even thinks of the potential danger, and he begins to sink. You see, Peter suffered from the fear of failure. For him, it was the fear of failure. Have you had those moments in your life where you've experienced the same thing? When it seems like, all you can focus on is everything that might go wrong in the moment, everything that might happen that's bad. Maybe you get excited about something. Maybe you finally work up the courage, the bravery to step out and to do whatever it is. And then all of a sudden, all that you can see is just the waves and the storm. And you start to think things like, oh man, what have I done? I can't do this. I'm drowning. And maybe it's not even an internal thing. Sometimes it could even be something from outside. Maybe something that someone has said to you when you've had that moment of courage and you stepped out in that brave way. Maybe something that someone says to you. I mean, I kind of wonder if the other apostles see Peter and they're like, dude, you are going to drown. What are you doing out there? And maybe in the moment he's like, oh my goodness, yes, I am going to drown. And he starts to sink, because sometimes that can happen to us. You see, I think one of the reasons that fear can be so paralyzing for us is that sometimes we maybe look at the success of other people and the things that they're doing, and it maybe kind of like what we talked about last week of how we see we when we're jealous of people, we see their highlight reel and all we see is our behind the scenes reel, and we think that we think that it's all good things, and we miss all their failures and all the things, and so for us we become afraid because all we see are the negative things that may happen to us, and we think, well, I'm not them, I'm not good enough, I can't do these things. It's kind of like when you see an airplane in the sky or you fly on a plane, no one thinks about all the failures of the Wright brothers, right? The many times that they didn't work out for them. All we think about are the successes. But then when we get into a situation, we think of our potential failures. And that's what Peter's situation was. He was so afraid of failing. The next person I want us to see is Elijah. Elijah was one of the prophets of the Old Testament. A prophet was a spokesman for God. So a lot of times, majority of times, a prophet would go to God's people and tell them God's message for that moment. Sometimes they would tell of what was coming ahead. But Elijah goes and he's warning these people. He goes specifically to these prophets of Baal. He's out up on this place called Mount Carmel, and he is telling them, hey, listen, this Baal that you're worshiping, he's not really real. He's not even there. But the God that I'm here to represent, he is real, and he's trying to convince them. And they have this little showdown between the two of them. And you can read about it in 1 Kings 18, I believe it is where the whole situation happens. But basically, it comes down to the fact that Elijah shows the true power of God, and the 500 prophets of Baal are shown to be false, and that they're following a false God. And Elijah has this wonderful moment, this awesome moment of victory that God has given him. I mean, he should be on cloud nine and excited, but that's not what he goes through in this moment. Instead, we see this in 1 Kings 19:9. There, he went into a cave and spent the night, and the word of the Lord came to him. What are you doing here, Elijah? He replied, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. You see, Elijah comes off this moment of excitement and victory, and God's done something so great in him. And again, all he can think about is all the negativity. And you would think that he would be excited about these things. You would think that he would be celebrating this victory. But instead, he runs and he hides in a cave, all because he thinks that, he's alone. And you might look at this and you might think, Elijah, what's your problem? Why are you there? But Elijah, he finds himself just caught up in the fear of being the only one. And sometimes that's how we can get this fear of that I'm going to be the only one. And that can be a really scary thing. And the truth is, it can also happen even when you're surrounded by a crowd of people. Being literally the only one, when you are away from people, being by yourself, that can be a scary thing too. I don't know if you're married or if you have kids or whatever, if you live with someone else, when they're gone, it seems like everything in the house, all the shadows are bigger and more noticeable, and the creaks and the sounds just seem to be louder because someone else isn't there. And all these things, it's unnerving to be alone. And sure, that's a little scary, but what about when other people are around? And we begin to feel that feeling even when we're in a crowd, and even when we're in the normal routines of life, and we see other people at school and in our neighborhoods and at home and at work, and we can still feel like the only one sometimes. The only one pursuing God's purpose and plan for life. The only one wanting to say no when everyone else is saying yes. Or the only one wanting to say yes when everyone else is saying no. The only one, or at least it feels like sometimes, the only one that really cares about the needs of my family. Or the only one that really cares about my needs or my struggles or my pain or my issues. And again, we can get into this moment. We can get into these feelings and these fears of being all alone and the only one, even when we're surrounded by people. And even when we're involved in doing things, but still we can be eaten up on the inside. And we can even sometimes avoid parts of life, all because we're afraid of being the only one. Well, the third person I want us to see from the Old Testament again is the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah, just like Elijah, was another prophet, another spokesman for God. And Isaiah, he kind of was in a unique time for God's people, the Israelites. They were kind of facing some of the greatest hardships that God's people ever faced in those days. Within themselves, they were not being faithful to God. And so what they were facing was the Assyrian Empire and even the Babylonian Empire were kind of bearing down on them. And God was basically trying to tell them through Isaiah that if they didn't change their ways, if they didn't turn from their sinfulness, that God was going to allow these empires to come in and take them captive and to use them as God's punishment on them. But before he goes out to bring this message to God's people and warning them of what God might do, Isaiah has an encounter with God. And we see it in Isaiah chapter 6. It says this in verse 1. In the year King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and exalted and seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With two wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Woe to me, I cried. I am ruined. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Isaiah comes face to face with God in his throne room, basically. And he gets this incredible vision of seeing all that's taking place there and this glimpse of what is going on there. And it strikes him in a powerful way. He realizes where he is in this holy dwelling place of a holy God. And even the creatures and what they're doing, of how they're calling out to each other about God's holiness over and over again. And the creatures even are covering their eyes and covering their feet, which is a way of showing and symbolizing the fact that they recognize God's holiness. And Isaiah's reaction is, oh man, I can't be here. And Isaiah, he becomes consumed with the fear of guilt. All he can see in his own life in that moment is his own guilt. And I really believe that this kind of fear, that the fear of guilt can be one of the worst fears to experience, especially when we have this fear of guilt in relationship to God, because many times this is the fear that drives people away from God. Oftentimes when we're afraid in moments of fear, maybe it drives us to God and we're like, God, help me in this moment. But many times our guilt, the fear of being guilty, can drive us away from him. See, too many people have this image of God in their mind as this vengeful, angry God, and he is just waiting up there in the clouds with the lightning bolts, ready to zap us as soon as we get out of line. But that's not what we see in the scriptures. We see examples within Jesus' life of him loving the unlovable, loving the sinner, loving the outcast, loving the one that no one wants to be around. But unfortunately, many times there are people who kind of still have this fear. I mean, that's why maybe when you invite somebody that you work with or in your neighborhood to church, that's why sometimes people will say things like, oh, I can't go to your church. Man, if I step foot in your church, that place will burn to the ground, or, it'll get struck by lightning, or, a hurricane. And people will say these things. And I think sometimes we couch that fear of guilt in a joke in that way. But there are a lot of people that guilt is what drives them away from God. And even I think sometimes that guilt can even drive us away from other people. Who could love me? There's no way that they'll want to see me. I'm sure they've forgotten about me. It's been so long since we've talked. How embarrassing would it be just to go back and talk to them? And that fear just kind of drives us further and further and further away from people and from God. The last person I want us to see this morning, an example of his fear was Moses. Moses was a guy, or is a guy, I guess you could say, that people know about even if you're not a Christian. There's things, we've seen in movies, everything from Charlton Heston movies to the Prince of Egypt and different things that people know about his life. But he lived a complicated life, especially growing up. Pharaoh saw God's people, the Israelites, growing in number and kind of getting so big that he was terrified of what they might do if they turned on him and the others. And so he began to try and kill them off. He actually gave orders for all the boys 3 years and under to be killed. And so Moses' mother finds out about this and goes and hides him, puts him in the reeds in a basket. And Pharaoh's daughter eventually finds him there and eventually raises him in Pharaoh's palace. But he eventually kills an Egyptian. He sees an Egyptian abusing one of his fellow Hebrews. He steps in and kills this man, and then he flees in fear. And he goes back out and he eventually becomes a shepherd. And one day, while he's out doing his thing with his sheep and tending to his flocks, he sees this bush that's on fire, but it's not burning up. And he goes over and he checks it out, and God speaks to him. It says this in Exodus 3, verse 7. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I've come down to rescue them from the land of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Moses hears this request, actually not even a request from God, but the instructions from God, and he says, I can't go back there. I can't go to that place. I can't go and do this. I mean, see, Moses, he kind of has like a in-depth knowledge of what's going on there, especially at Pharaoh's palace. He knows the behind-the-scenes stuff. He knows how they might treat him. And he knows what they would expect of him. He's like, look, I'm just a shepherd. And he even kind of goes on from there and kind of gives a bunch of different excuses to God. And he's like, look, if I show up and say, God sent me, how are they going to believe me? They're going to think I'm out of my mind. Or, I can't speak very well. I'm not a very good orator. I don't speak well at all. You see, for Moses, it was the fear of not being good enough. It was this idea that if I go back, I'm not going to be good enough. They won't believe me. I won't be able to say the right things in the right way at the right time in the right manner. I'll just mess it all up. And maybe that's kind of how you feel in your life. Maybe you look at that job opportunity and you see what is available for you, but really all you see is, well, I'm not good enough for that. Maybe you see that relationship, but all you see is, well, I'm not good enough for that. Or maybe you even see or feel the call of God on your own life into a relationship with Him, but all you can think is, well, I'm not good enough for Him. Look, God doesn't need us to be good enough. He didn't get Moses to be good enough. He didn't wait on him to be smart enough or brave enough or to have good enough public speaking skills. He just needed him to be him and to be willing. And the thing is, for all these people we've looked at this morning, every single one of them in all their different situations, it's not about them being good enough or wise enough or perfect or sin-free enough. In the end, you and I, we just need to be people of courage. Now, I don't know how it is for you in your life, but sometimes I'll remember maybe a quote, or maybe there's like a song lyrics or a poem or something like that you kind of can remember halfway. You ever experienced that before? It's like you got the first half of it and you're like, what is the end of it and who said that? And so while I was working on this message, man, this quote kept on popping in my head over and over. And it starts out, courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is not the absence of fear. And I kept on thinking about that, but I could not remember how it ended. Or I couldn't even think about, well, who was the one that actually said, what it was. And so I did what any good researcher would do in a moment where they needed some help. I went to Google. That's right. You go to Google, and that's where you get all the answers, right? So I hopped on Google, and I typed out, courage is not the absence of fear. And the funny thing was, I found like a dozen different people that it was attributed to, and like a dozen different endings for the quote. So I thought I'd share a few of them with you. This first one was from Carly Fiorina. Sure, if that's how you say it. I apologize, Carly, if she's watching. Probably not. She said, courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is acting in spite of fear. And I was like, wow, I like that. That's pretty good. Or here's another one. This second one was attributed to FDR. Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the assessment that something else is more important than fear. I liked that one too. Here's another one, apparently by Mark Twain. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. That sounds like Mark Twain. That's a good kind of wordsmith there. Here's another one by Nelson Mandela. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's inspiring others to move beyond it. I like that. But then I found another quote that was supposed to be by Nelson Mandela again. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. And man, there were more and more quotes of these things. You could go on. You could find some more of your own. Names I didn't recognize, names I did recognize. I even found one. It was great. It was supposed to be attributed to Abraham Lincoln, but the grammar, it wasn't even a coherent sentence. I was like, I really hope that was not Abraham Lincoln that said that one. But I don't know who said it first, and I really don't even know the ending of the real quote. I don't know what the real ending is for it there. But as I was reading through all these different quotes, I thought, well, hey, I want in on this game. If they can make up quotes, if they can make up things, then I can make up one too. So here it is for me. And this is what I think, especially applying into what we're talking about today. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is remembering that God is with you. I'll say it again, that courage is not the absence of fear. It is remembering that God is with you. You see, it's not that I'm never going to be afraid again. It's not that I'm going to go through life and, that I'm never going to see anything that kind of terrifies me. I'm never going to have those moments where I back off and think, I don't know about this. Because, again, sometimes fear is a good thing. Sometimes we need fear in our lives, but we can't allow fear to be what controls us. I have, in my adult life, I have preached over 500 sermons probably. There are some times that, or I would say there is every time, there is still a fear that sets in before I get up and do this. It's not the same kind of fear I used to have. When I was, new to preaching and I was a young college student, I had to do it. I would get the old knots in my stomach and kind of the butterflies, and I was feeling like, oh man, I'm either going to get up there and do great or I'm going to throw up on stage. I don't know which is going to be. It'll be memorable, right? Hey, but it used to be that, and maybe or I'd be like the shaking hands, and you kind of see them, you're holding on to the table or podium, you're like, and it's not that anymore. It's in different ways. I was talking to Allie, my daughter, recently the other day. We were sitting at the breakfast table talking about stuff, and she's in dance, and she was talking about her recital coming up next month, and she said, I have stage fright. And I was like, you do not have stage fright. If you know my daughter, she has no fright of being on stage. She wants the spotlight. She was nervous. I think really she's nervous about what she's going to do. And it's so much different. You see, we all get nervous. We all have moments in our life when those fears may creep in. But again, it's not about not having any kind of fear. You see, courage is not about the absence of fear. It's remembering that God is with you. If we think back to the examples that we saw this morning, for Peter, courage is not the absence of fear. It's remembering that God is right there in front of you, ready to pick you up when you begin to sink. For Elijah, courage is not the absence of fear. It's remembering that God is with you and he has so many others around you to love and support you. For Isaiah, courage is not the absence of fear. It's remembering that God is with you even when you are a person that screws it up and you live around people and you're with people who also screw it up and you need God's grace and forgiveness. For Moses, courage is not the absence of fear. It's remembering that God is with you and I don't have to get it all right. I don't have to be perfect. I don't have to do it right all the time because God is going to go with me and help me out. And so for you and for me, for all of us, courage is not the absence of fear. It's remembering that God is with you when you feel like you're the only one who's going to say no. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's remembering that God is with you when you feel like you've been waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, and you're probably going to have to wait some more still. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's remembering that God is with you when you have been diagnosed with something that you are terrified of. When your child comes home with news that breaks your heart or makes you want to break someone's face or whatever they've done to them. Or when no matter what you face and no matter what you go through, courage is not the absence of fear. It's remembering that God is with you. You see, folks, God is with us. David, when he wrote some of the Psalms, he went through some incredible emotions in different times. And there was one point in his life when he was going through great remorse and pain and guilt. And he wrote some words about not being able to get away from God. But it was a good way. Because sometimes I think people hear that idea of not being able to get away from God and they're like, oh man, I don't know if I like that too much. But for him, it was an encouragement and it was a comfort. So I want to finish up by sharing with you what he wrote in Psalm 139 and verse 7. He says, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. Friends, we have got to remember when we go through moments of fear in our life that courage is not the absence of fear. It is remembering that God is with you and me. Let me pray for us. God, I thank you for being with us, for walking alongside us, for sometimes pushing us along, sometimes carrying us along, for being there with us. God, I know that we're going to all face moments and times and situations of fear. And I hope that in this time this morning that maybe we have seen ourselves in your scriptures and in these situations only so that we can be reminded that you brought others through their fear and you can do the same thing for us. So God, I pray that you would help us with that. I pray that you would help us call to mind and call to memory the moments that maybe we're allowing to hold us back and to wrap us up and to keep us from the life you've created us for. But God, I also pray that you would give us that clarity to see how you are still going to be with us. God, we know life is not going to be perfect. Life is not going to be easy all the time. But we can know that you are going to be with us. And that we can be reminded that you're going to walk alongside us in these moments of fear and of struggle and of pain. And you're going to bring us to the other side. So God, help us to have that courage. Help us to trust in you. Help us to remember that you are with us in all these things. And we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Guys, if I just stand.